afternoon, everyone. My name is Christine Goodfellow. I'm the Academic Program Manager here at Gresham College, and I'd like to welcome you for coming to our lunchtime lecture today. Whether you're here in the hall or whether you're joining us online, thank you very much for making time. A few housekeeping announcements. If there's a fire alarm, we've had the fire drill earlier, but if it rings now, it's for real, so please use any of the two doors in the back, and the Gresham team will help you find a safe space to shelter. After the lecture, we're going to have time for questions online and in the hall. In the hall, my colleague Angela will bring over the microphone, and online you will see on the bottom left corner of your screen a QR code. You can scan that and submit questions, and we'll try to keep it fair between online and in-person audience. Those of you in the hall who do not want to raise their hands, you will also have a QR code on the side screen, so you can also use those. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who's made a donation, whether it's small or large. You've helped us with our work here at Gresham College. We're in a fortunate position that between now and the 9th of December, all donations will be doubled. So thank you very much for all of you who've helped us with our work here to keep lectures free. I'd like to introduce Professor Steve Tsang now, who's going to deliver the third lecture in our series on modern China. Professor Tsang is the Professor of China Studies and the Director of the China Institute at SOAS, London. He's also a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and an Emeritus Professor of St. Antony's College in Oxford. His lecture today will be Where China is Heading under Xi Jinping. Please welcome Professor Tsang.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Christine, for inviting me back. I am delighted to have this chance to talk to you. The subject is Where is China Heading under Xi Jinping? That's a funny title. It's as if implying that one of the world's largest countries, most populous country, the second most populous country with 1.4 billion people, will have its direction of travel, its future being determined by one man. Yes, that's exactly what I meant. And I meant it because we are dealing with a China which is a bit unusual even in the history of China in the last 40 years. We are dealing with a situation in China where the political system, the formal political system in China itself, has not changed since the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949. Under Mao Zedong for a quarter of a century into the mid-1970s, then from Deng Xiaoping from December 1978 until Xi Jinping became leader in 2012, and then Xi Jinping from 2012 to today. I mark them out as three periods because I want to use a 21st century language to illustrate the changes. The system politically remains what we call a Leninist system. Most of you probably know exactly what a Leninist system means, but some may not be so familiar with it. So let me just say that a Leninist system is what we used to have in what we used to call communist countries in the communist Eastern Bloc, where the Communist Party exists and superintends and leads a government in parallel, and it's the party that calls the shot. Now, in the first period of China under Mao Zedong, I call it as a China operating under operating system 1.0. It was Maoist, it was totalitarian, it was at first with the party at the center of it. But when the party was not doing what Mao wanted, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution and practically destroyed the party as an effective organization for a while. When Deng Xiaoping started to change and introduced the so-called reform and opening up period from December 1978, that is when operating system 2.0 was put in place. And the big distinction between 1.0 and 2.0 was that 2.0 was a return to collective leadership. Successions were being arranged in a very orderly fashion, and leadership within the Communist Party were operating collectively and they were making decisions together. Even, believe it or not, increasingly after the Beijing massacre of 1989, with what they call intra-party democracy. What does that mean in plain language? It means at the very top of the party structure, at the Politburo Standing Committee, in those periods, there are usually 9 people, sometimes including a woman, and they were operating as, with the General Secretary operating as first among equals. And by the time we got to Hu Jintao even required the Politburo and the Politburo Standing Committee members to make an annual report to the Central Committee of the Communist Party, a bit over 200 people, on an annual basis. So there was some element of accountability, and within closed doors, they actually had debates and discussions on policies. And that avoided China making one major policy mistake that could potentially destabilize China or the Communist Party rule in China from 1989, after the Beijing massacre, through the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, until relatively recently, a decade ago. Xi Jinping, after he became leader in 2012, he started to make changes. By the end of his first term in office, 2017, when he secured his second term, he also started to make changes. A few months later, by 2018, he said clearly that every member of the Politburo Standing Committee must make an annual report to the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Who does the General Secretary of the Communist Party report to? Well, to the General Secretary of the Communist Party, you must. Or indeed, to nobody. He is answerable to Marx and nobody else. He, by that point, became the boss. He became the strongman leader running a Communist Party reinvigorated as a Leninist party, a Leninist instrument of control. And one of the first things Xi Jinping did when he became leader of China in 2012 was to start what officially was being launched as an anti-corruption campaign. Now, that was really clever of him. Anti-corruption campaign. Who could object to that? I mean, China was a bit corrupt. Well, in fact, systematically corrupt at the point. There were a lot of jokes going around towards the end of the Hu Jintao decade, basically saying that the party was now so corrupt that if we sort it out, the party might be in trouble. But if we don't sort it out, the country will be in trouble. So what do? Well, we do nothing, because it's too difficult to do. And in any event, the party is more important. Xi Jinping started off by saying anti-corruption campaign. And campaign is a word that implies there's a starting point and an ending point. So his fellow comrades in the Politburo and Politburo Standing Committee, or indeed the Central Committee, were also thinking that, okay, new leader is in charge, he's going to make some changes, he's going to have his anti-corruption campaign, it's going to last 6 months, a year, worst case scenario 2, then we can get back to business. Wrong. Xi Jinping meant an anti-corruption drive with no ending point. Why? Because the anti-corruption drive is the trading name of something else much more important. It is a party rectification operation, something which will enable the top leader to purify the party, purge it of the weak-willed, purge it of the people who are not committed to the ideas that Xi Jinping is advocating. And with that, in 2 terms of 5 years by the 20-party Congress of 2022, Xi Jinping had been effectively removed from the top echelon of the Chinese Communist Party anybody who was not a Xi Jinping supporter. And that's how he got a 3rd term in office, because one of the most important changes Deng Xiaoping had introduced was an orderly succession process in order to make sure that stability and good order will continue and that will sustain the welfare of China as well as the welfare of the Communist Party. But by removing succession, things have completely changed. And that's why I'm talking about changes so important that we're not talking about modification. We're talking about basic change, a change in the way how the system operates, not the structure of the system. Hence, the comparisons to the digital language of the computer hardware hasn't actually changed. The political system hasn't changed. But the way how it operates had changed from operating system 1.0 to 2.0 and now under 3.0. Now, what then is the most important part of operating system 3.0? Is the introduction of something which Xi Jinping called Xi Jinping Thought, or to give it its full name, Xi Jinping Thought on Socialism with Chinese Characteristics for a New Era. Now, the very long-winded formulations was something that a lot of colleagues in the China politics field thought that he's used this convoluted formulation because he couldn't have it simply adopted, accepted as Xi Jinping Thought. But what we often overlook was that Xi Jinping actually tells you quite openly what he wants to do. He is underlying that it is for a new era. Xi Jinping Thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics. The Chinese characteristic element is there not only because Deng Xiaoping had previously used it, but because Xi Jinping wants to underline that his version of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought now being summed up and presented better as Xi Jinping Thought is fundamentally Chinese. He is talking about something different from what Mao Zedong talked about. When Mao Zedong was the leader of the Communist Party, trying to get the Communist Party into power, he tried something called the signification of Marxism-Leninism. And that was about adapting a Europe-based, proletarian, urban-based revolution into the Chinese agrarian context without capitalism. Otherwise, you couldn't actually make Marxism-Leninism work in the Chinese context. When Xi Jinping is talking about making Marxism-Leninism Chinese, he is saying that Marxism-Leninism is, under its incarnation as Xi Jinping Thought, the ultimate development of China's history, civilization, and culture. They seamlessly come together. Chinese civilization and culture becomes the greatest with the adoption and application of Marxism-Leninism. Marxism-Leninism might have collapsed in the place where it originated, but in China, it is doing better than ever. Xi Jinping Thought, therefore, is to be seen and embraced and accepted as the de facto new state ideology of China. And Xi Jinping Thought, therefore, provides a clear guide of where he wants China to go. Hence the title of this talk about where is China heading under Xi Jinping. And so, to answer that question, the destination is the fulfillment of the China dream of national rejuvenation, which is meant to be accomplished by the centenary of the People's Republic of China. And since the PRC was founded in 1949, so the target date is 2049. And occasionally, Xi Jinping being Xi Jinping, he has a monopoly of the truth, so he can say things without necessarily having to be consistent. He would sometimes say, oh, it's 2050, to just make it neat. On different occasions, 2049, centenary. But either way, the difference is in a few months. What then would the fulfillment of the China dream of national rejuvenation implies? There are two dimensions to it. There's the domestic dimension, and there is the global dimension. And again, I use my word here carefully. I didn't say the external dimension. I say the global dimension, because it's not a distinction simply between domestic and external. It's between China and the wider world. Domestically, what does Xi Jinping want to do? He wants to forge in China one country, one people, one party, one ideology, one leader. I'll come back to explain that. And globally, he wants to forge the common destiny for humankind. Now, the last term, the common destiny for humankind, will be unfamiliar to most of you. With all due respect, I can see that most of you are not native Chinese speakers. So I would assume that you would have been reading about China through the regular, normal English language media, in which case you would have heard a different term, which is to build a community of shared future. But if you go back to the original Chinese text, the word community isn't there. The description of shared future isn't there, because a community of shared future is a description that, again, not objectionable to any reasonable person, because it implies a community of free agents by their own free will choosing to share a future. What's wrong with that? Now, except that is not what the original language is. The original language is about a common destiny for humankind. And that has to be forged. And somebody will have to lead it. And it's not among equals. And I'll come back to this too in a bit. Going back to the internal bit first, the reason why I have to go back to the internal first before I go to the global dimension is because the way how Xi Jinping sees things. Here he can see very clearly that interests, China's national interests, exist in concentric circles. If you see China's national interests as a big circle, inside that you have another circle, which is the Chinese Communist Party. And inside the Communist Party, you have another little smaller circle, and that is the core of the Communist Party. No prize in guessing who's the core of the Communist Party. 3 characters, Xi Jinping. And from that perspective of the concentric circles, what is good for the core is good for the party. What is good for the party is good for China. And what is good for China is good for the rest of the world. And that's why I have to go back to the domestic dimension first before I can explain what the China dream of national rejuvenation globally means. For the building of the one country, one people, one ideology, one party, one leader, Xi Jinping underlined the very central importance that China is one country. What is China? Is China simply defined as whatever the map internationally accepted as the map of the People's Republic of China is therefore China? Or is it a bit rather bigger than that? Well, obviously, it's the second part, the second answer that is the correct one, because China is whatever the Communist Party says it is. It includes, for example, places like Taiwan. If you look at history books from outside of China, you will have noticed that Taiwan has never been under the jurisdiction of the People's Republic of China. But it is a sacred territory of China, and that is so defined, so it must be the result. And Taiwan is not by any means the only one. It is just the single most important one that is right there. The unity of China and its people, therefore, is a mission that every Chinese citizen must be committed to. Oh, sorry, I need to correct myself, because to say that every Chinese citizen, I am taking a position of the People's Republic of China government before Xi Jinping. The position Xi Jinping takes is that if there is Chinese blood running through your veins, you are Chinese. And if you are Chinese, then you would want to be a patriotic Chinese. If you are a patriotic Chinese, you will support the party, you will love the leader of the country, and you will fulfill the China dream of national rejuvenation. So that expectation goes beyond your formal citizenship of the PRC. And indeed, it contradicts the Chinese nationality law, because the Chinese nationality law clearly says that if you're a Chinese citizen by birth, but then have acquired a foreign citizenship by residence, by settlement, the point you acquire a foreign citizenship by settlement, you lose Chinese citizenship automatically. Xi Jinping reversed that. It doesn't really matter what the law says. The great man has spoken, so the new rule must apply. Now, getting back to the point about the one country, the unity of the one country also means that national minorities within China must behave like patriotic Chinese. And that identity of Chineseness is fundamentally based on China's single largest ethnic group and culture, the Han people. Now, we can argue whether the Han people is completely a single one, but that's generally being seen as one. They would mostly say that they are one, even if they are actually much more diverse than that. So if you were a minority in Tibet or in Xinjiang, which is a Turkic people area with largely Islamic belief, you will need to behave like a proper Chinese. And a proper Chinese eat pork, drinks alcohol, mostly clean-shaven, and don't read certain books, etc. So there is a very strong element that all these people need to be helped. And how do you do that? You do it by, first of all, reinvigorating the Communist Party as an instrument of control and an instrument for delivering government services more effectively. The two are not mutually exclusive. An efficient government will be able to do a lot more for you, but it can also control you more effectively. You also need to be helped to get into the mindset. You need proper ideological guidance, because otherwise you think the wrong thought. And if we all, as a people, think the right thought and are being held by an effective and efficient government led by the Communist Party, how much more we can do, how much more we can actually deliver. And if you're going to fulfill something as grand as the China dream of national rejuvenation, you need one country, one people. And you need one party, that Communist Party, which has that capacity to deliver. And that's why he started off by the ratification operation being described publicly as an anti-corruption drive. That's why even after Xi Jinping has consolidated power in the 20-party Congress, when he started his third term, and since the Deng Xiaoping era, nobody is supposed to have a third term. Everybody is supposed to stand down after two terms, and therefore 10 years, and then 5 years into one's term, then you actually started appointing your successor, who will be apprentice leader for 5 years before he finally take over. Now, that's being changed. And that formulation of one country, one people, one party, you can have other parties, but they are purely for decorative purposes, and one leader. One leader, there is no succession arrangement being arranged, being even permitted to be talked about now. Whereas when Deng Xiaoping was supreme leader, he made at first Hu Yaobang and then Zhao Ziyang as the party secretary, and when he had to sack both of them because both of them were not doing exactly what Deng Xiaoping wanted him to do, and were showing, in quotation marks, weakness, he put in Jiang Zemin and also annoyed that Hu Jintao should be the next one. You have a pretty orderly transition arrangement. Xi Jinping now does not allow anybody who is at the right age level to be at the Politburo, who could therefore potentially be promoted at the next party congress into the Politburo Standing Committee and as General Secretary of the party as a potential successors to him. Now you can't even talk about it. And we are now talking about a leader who is clearly not thinking about his mortality. He is at a very youthful 71. And if you have been watching news on China at the time of the September-October visit of Putin and Kim Jong-un, you would have caught the hot mic moment when they jokingly, lightheartedly talk about mortality, and they was talking about, for people like us, 150 is a very manageable age. But of course, the key operating term here is for people like us. And with all due respect, not like me or everyone else in this grand lecture room, but the special people, they can. I think that does kind of underline why we are talking about the formulation of one country, one people, one ideology, one party, one leader, having China building up all that capacity to do the China dream of national rejuvenation. And the China dream of national rejuvenation can be presented in another way, in 4 English words: make China great again. Now, you laugh. Thank you. You laugh because we all know about the other variations, which is make America great again. I didn't use it simply because Donald Trump has used it. I've used it well, partly because I'm naughty, and I did like to see whether I could get that reaction from you, which I got. But also because Xi Jinping, in his own way, is seriously intending to deliver just that. Now, what does making China great again? It's not benchmark against American global hegemony. It's benchmark against, in quotation marks, China's historical greatness. Now, I put it in quotation marks because what China's historical greatness means can mean very different things to different people. If we include people outside of China, if we include people inside China only, there is only one meaning now. There's only one meaning because in 2013, the year after Xi Jinping became top leader, he introduced something called historical nihilism. And historical nihilism had, since 2013, been prohibited, it's been banned. And what historical nihilism means? It means presenting an interpretation of history that is in contrary with or in variance with that presented by the Communist Party of China or its supreme leader. Or indeed, even trying to provide evidence to show that the official government party interpretation of history is not correct. There's now only one version of history in China, and that is always the correct version because it is the party's version, is Xi Jinping's version. And in this version of history, the greatest moment in human history was when China was the greatest, most powerful, richest, innovative, dynamic, and organized country in the world. It was so magnificent and so munificent that other countries will simply look up to China in admiration and in awe, that they would like to embrace and follow the leadership of China voluntarily. And you would have Pax Sinica without China attempting to exercise hegemony. Hegemony is the sort of things that Western imperialists do. As Xi Jinping has explained, we Chinese, in 5,000 years of history, that we evolved from the Yellow River Basin to become a continental-sized country, that we have never, ever invaded anybody. There is not one single imperialist gene in the Chinese gene pool. It cannot happen. Now, that means what he is trying to establish is a kind of global preeminence on Chinese terms. And how does he see about constructing something like that? This then goes back to the forging of a common destiny for humankind through a process that he calls the democratization of international relations. What does that mean, democratization of international relations? You don't know because you, great British citizens, are part of the democratic West. You have forgotten that the liberal international order that was put in place at the end of the Second World War was fundamentally an international order of the West, by the West, and for the West. And the West, with all due respect, is a minority in the world in terms of member states of the United Nations and in terms of the population of the world. The overwhelming majority of people in the world belong to the global South. And the overwhelming majority of member states of the United Nations are in the global South. And China, as Xi Jinping keep on reminding us, is forever a member of the global South. And China, therefore, is the natural leader of the global South. And China, through its Belt and Road Initiative and Xi Jinping's 4 global initiatives on development, security, civilization, and governance will engage with people in the global south and reassure them that no individual country, i.e. United States, or group of countries, i.e. the democratic West, have the right to tell them how they should live their life and how they should organize their government. If they simply support China, China will make sure that their interests and their right to have to govern their own country and their own people in whichever way they want is fully respected. And we, China, will help you with your development assistance that those Western countries will not do unless you meet their conditionalities. We do not impose conditionalities. Our Belt and Road Initiative are given to you without conditionalities. We don't give you the aids, the grants. Mostly we give you the loans that you cannot get from the World Bank or the IMF. How about that? Oh, one more thing. You just also need to support our position on Taiwan. Do I need to explain more clearly that all those that you have to contribute do not require you, as leader of your country, or your citizens, taxpayers, to pay anything out of your national exchequer? You only have to agree and get the UN to pay the price and get Taiwan to pay the price. And we will look after your interests. If you happen to be an autocrat running an autocracy, we are effectively giving you a charter that you have the right to be whatever you are. It's not a narrative that does not have appeal in the global south. We have to be realistic that a majority of countries in the so-called global south are not full-blown democracies, even if some of them have democratic structures and institutions. Most of them are either very faulted democracies or are outright autocracies. And the Chinese offer has certain attraction. And from their perspective, China has a very clear advantage. I mean, when here we talk about the global south, we're talking mostly about Africa, we're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about large part of Asia, we are talking about Latin America. Nearly all of those territories have, at different stages, suffered from Western colonization. China, apart from parts of Asia, does not have a record as a colonial power in most of those countries. It's a lot easier for China to speak and engage them without having to deal with the historical legacy of imperialism of the 18th and 19th century in particular, where a lot of countries still remember the imperial period and use that as an explanation for the difficulties they are facing in their own transition. So there is that element of appeal. Now, Taiwan. Taiwan is important because Taiwan is the second important part of Xi Jinping's global strategy. The first part, as I explained, and the first part, I would call it actually as the first pivot of Xi Jinping's global strategy, is to engage with that global south to win that support, to secure general endorsement and acceptance that if China becomes preeminent in the international system, it will be acceptable to them. It's about internally transforming the liberal international order, the UN in particular, into a different way of operation that puts China and the global south ahead of the others. Now, Taiwan. Taiwan matters not only because the Communist Party say Taiwan matters. And here, before I explain that more, let me flag up something which is not allowed to be said in China, which is that historically, from the 1920s to the 1940s, the single most important and loudest advocate for an independent Taiwan was none other than the Chinese Communist Party. Yes, you heard it right. That's why I spoke slowly about it. You are not allowed to say that in China now, but that's a fact. Particularly, you can find it from the record of the Soviet Union, because when the Communist Party was first founded in China, it was a chapter of the Third Communist International, the Comintern. And the Communist Party of China actually held its sixth party congress in Moscow, where that record is being kept and where it said very clearly that it was their policy to support an independent Taiwan, because Taiwan at that point was a Japanese colony. Now, going back to Taiwan and its importance, Taiwan exists today as an entity separate from China, for all intents and purposes, independent, because the Americans have given it protection. And the Americans have passed a law called the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979, which effectively says that the US government takes it seriously about the status of Taiwan, and if the status of Taiwan were to be changed against the wishes of the people of Taiwan, then the United States will see it as a matter of national security interests, which effectively means we are going to interfere. And that's why the Chinese cannot take Taiwan. It doesn't really matter whether the legality and the sovereignty issues arguments are. If China wants to take Taiwan, China would have taken Taiwan if the American protection of Taiwan has not existed. So for China to take Taiwan, there are two options. One, peaceful resolution, which is Beijing's preference, which is everybody's preference, really. But a peaceful resolution would have meant Taiwan, a vibrant middle power, vibrant democracy that is a middle power, accepting being taken over by a Leninist party state under Xi Jinping. Historically, democracies that are medium powers have never surrendered without a fight when it faces an existential external threat. Being defeated, occupied, conquered, subjugated, yes. But doing so without a fight, it hasn't happened before. There's no reason to assume that will be different in how people in Taiwan will react to that. So the likelihood is that Taiwan can only be taken with China using force. It's a question of what level of force. And using force by China means it will either have to deter the Americans from interfering, or it will have to inflict sufficient damages on American forces deployed to help Taiwan defend itself so that the Americans back off. Either way, whether the Americans will deter or the Americans will defeat it and then back off, it would have fundamentally bankrupted America's Indo-Pacific strategy since the end of the Second World War. That Japan, Korea, and other American allies in the region could no longer depend on American guarantee under their Mutual Defense Treaty. Because if you look at the terms of the Taiwan Relations Act and the American defense treaties with countries like Japan or Korea or the Philippines, they are very, very similar language. And it will also have fundamentally diminished American global standing so much that even for people like us living in Europe or in the United Kingdom, we'll have to question whether the United States, after Taiwan, could be relied on as a NATO ally. Fundamentally, American global dominance will collapse. Chinese preeminence effectively will be put in place. The China dream for national rejuvenation would have been achieved. And that is, ladies and gentlemen, the direction of travel that Xi Jinping has set for China. I'm not saying that this is what is going to happen. There are a lot of things in the world that can happen that will have implications for that and impact on that. I'm simply explaining this is how it is being constructed and being seen as a way of setting the direction of travel for China under Xi Jinping if he stays in power for as long as he seems to think that he will. Thank you very much. I would welcome questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Professor Tsang. We have a microphone going around, so if any one of you would like to start the Q&A with a question, my colleague Rachel will actually bring the microphone. Gentleman here.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. Am I on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
This sounds to me a bit like the Emperor's clothes. Saying it doesn't make it so. He's not going to live to be 150. And I ask myself how sustainable this model is politically, economically, and ecologically. I mean, take, for example, the massive Tibetan dam scheme now. What's that doing to destroy China's ecology and everyone downstream and its international ambitions? So could you talk about that, please?
That's a really good question. I think we need to make a distinction of whether Xi Jinping is making the Leninist system in China more resilient in the short term, and whether he's making it more sustainable over the long term. And my answer would be that in the short term, he's actually making it more resilient because he is able to show that if there is any challenge that are emerging, he would immediately crack down on it. We have seen it happen already with how he managed the reversal of the zero COVID policy in 2022. But in the longer term, he is building up a lot more trouble. He has created a situation where massive amount of the outside world, from the US through Europe to Japan and Korea and Australia, and Taiwan, which had for nearly 40 years of the reform and opening up of the Deng Xiaoping era, actively help China to modernize and become richer and more powerful, becoming very uncomfortable with the rise of China. And that changed essentially in the last decade. Even in Europe, before the COVID pandemic, we were all very remarkably relaxed in our engagement with China, in our transfer of technology and management know-how to China, in welcoming Chinese students and colleagues into the best of our research institutions in the top-ranking innovative places and engage in research. Now that is facing a backlash because of what Xi Jinping has done, and he is raising questions about that. Now he's also, in his commitment to drive China in a direction of travel that it is going at the moment, ignoring some of the big challenges that China faces, one of which is whether China will be caught in the middle income trap. China is right at the point with an annual income of below 12,000 US dollars before it can move from the middle incomes to a high income threshold. And that's where historically most countries at that stage of development got caught by the middle income trap. And from our understanding of how countries that managed to break through the middle income trap in the post-war era shows, they mostly did it by investing heavily in the general education of the population. Now, Xi Jinping, with his focus on China developing cutting-edge, leading technological sectors, has invested hugely in the most elitist part of the Chinese educational establishment, but kept the general population poorly educated. China today is less educated in terms of its population than, say, Mexico or Turkey. And if you can't get your general population educated with the digital era coming, when you have either the much more highly skilled work or your delivery jobs, then you get a problem. You're not going to increase the lower middle part of your population and generate good income for them. If you use and rely on robots to replace humans, robots don't consume. You cannot generate domestic consumption to keep the economy going. So yes, in the longer term, he is creating problems. Whether he will live to 150, personally, I doubt it. I believe in much simpler science and biology. But the requirement for fulfilling the China dream of national rejuvenation only requires Xi Jinping to live to about 96 or 97, which is not beyond the realm of possibility in this day and age. But nothing is guaranteed. Look at what happens to Li Keqiang, the premier. He died relatively young. He has the same level of medical attention and support that Xi Jinping has.
We have another question from the hall. Rachel, we've got another microphone here which might work a bit better. Thank you.
How strong are Japanese armed forces? Would be Japan able alone to stop a Chinese invasion of Taiwan?
Japan will not be on its own involved in the defense of Taiwan because of the Japanese Constitution. Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution will effectively say that it will not be possible for that to happen. When the new Japanese Prime Minister said, I think last week, when she was being asked by a journalist whether a Chinese use of force against Taiwan would be seen by Japan as a reason for Japan to be involved, and her answer was an affirmative one, it was because of a different situation. The situation is that the assumption being the United States will interfere in the event of China using force against Japan. And American forces that will be deployed to help Taiwan defend itself will have to operate out of Japanese bases on Japan's mainland Japan, as well as Okinawa, which is also Japanese sovereign territory. And if Japanese bases are being used by American forces to help defend Taiwan, then the Japanese is reasonable in expecting that the Chinese military will attack those American bases, which happen to be Japanese sovereign territory, which would therefore qualify for Japan's self-defense force to be deployed for a self-defense operation in defense of Japan's national security and national survival. She has not actually changed what the Japanese legal position is. The Chinese government is making it look like Japan has changed and become much more aggressive on it. I hope that answered your question.
We've got one question from the online audience, from Tim. How does Xi Jinping control the military, and why have there been so many purges recently, even among long-standing Xi loyalists?
Good question. Xi Jinping controls the military partly by promoting people, which is something that all his predecessors as the top leader of China had done. He's also doing it by the use of the anti-corruption drive and party ratification operation. Now, why did he remove so many generals in the last 12 months? I mean, particularly in the last 2 months. Well, remember, by 2022, the 20th Party Congress, when Xi Jinping secured his 3rd term of office, he had removed from the party and the military. The Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, is first and foremost the military wing of the Communist Party, which is funded by the Chinese National Treasury, but it remains first and foremost a party military, and its first duty is to protect the party. National security comes after. National security, in the sense we normally understand it in this country, comes after that. But in China, national security and regime security are defined as exactly the same thing. In fact, the regime security is core of the national security. Now, what I'm really saying is that since by 2022, all senior generals who were non-Xi Jinping proteges have been removed. And if Xi Jinping is still serious about making sure that the PLA is strong in its military readiness and preparation and operational efficiency, then he will have to remove the corrupt people that he had himself appointed. For his first 2 terms, first 10 years, the party rectification operation did not remove one single, what the Chinese would call tigers. A tiger is essentially somebody's vice minister and above rank cadre in China. After 2022, tigers that are being taken down include Xi Jinping people. And the first batch of the senior generals being taken down, including the previous defense minister, had a record, a career record in the logistic department. As in all military, the logistic department is the one that usually is the most susceptible to corruption. The second batch that were being taken down came from the strategic force. The strategic force is China's missile force, your nuclear deterrence force. Again, it is potentially the easiest ones to be to allow for corruption without being easily detected, because you don't deploy all your strategic missiles at once at any one point, unless the chips have all come down and you are in a crisis. You only need enough operational, and then you can have a lot of others which are not, and that could give you scope for corruption. And then you also have a problem of the system, which is that when the political environment is one that encourages factionalism, when all other factions are being removed and the entire Communist Party becomes the Xi Jinping faction, sub-faction emerges. And within the PLA, for example, under Xi Jinping, you have the Shanxi faction, you also have the Fujian faction. Amongst the 9 generals that were removed in the last month or so, they were people from the Fujian faction, and the information I have is that it is the Shanxi faction generals who were putting those Fujian generals in trouble. And I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. I think we're out of time, but I've got a moment to remind you of the next lecture in our series. We have no lectures in this Modern China series in spring, but in summer we have 2. The next one will be given by Dr. Luke Robinson on Going Global, Independent Chinese Documentary Films. So I hope you can join us then on the 27th of May. Feels wrong to think of May now, before Christmas, but yeah, that's the next one. And thank you very much, Professor Tsang, for your lecture today.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a good pleasure.